Greetings, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Diana Conway. I'm the president of the Montgomery County Women's Democratic Club. We are a group of over 600 Democratic women and men focused on electing Democrats up and down the ballot and enacting Democratic priorities. It is my great pleasure to welcome you and to welcome our speaker, Kristen Clarke, the president and executive director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I've got a few quick announcements, and then I think we've got a surprise PSA, otherwise I will make it. We welcome your questions throughout the program. Just put them in the chat box, if you would, at the bottom, directed to the ID WDC Q&A. As I mentioned, we're a membership program. Many of you will be up for renewal in August, and I ask you to please check your status and renew online at the www.womensdemocratic.org. There's an easy troubleshooting support option with a real person behind it. Thank you, former President Linda Kolko. I'm happy to say we're joined by a number of elected officials today, including District 16 Delegate Sarah Love, who's also a former board chair for Maryland ACLU, District 18 Delegate Jared Solomon, former education staffer for US Senator Casey and a new dad, and also Delegate from District 15, Lily Chi, who represents the Up County, and welcome to all of you. If I missed anyone, please put yourself in the chat to our WDC Q&A, and I would like to be able to acknowledge you. Thank you for joining us. We've had an event-filled summer, and our previous speakers' broadcasts are on the WDC YouTube channel. If you don't have it bookmarked already, this is a good time to do that. WDC has stood up a task force on racial equity in public safety and presented testimony on the proposed council legislation on the police use of force. And we're following the state working group on the police use of force, a topic that is also addressed by our two most recent speakers. Our website includes a racial justice page with a lot of resources to read or watch or download onto your podcast. And WDC is deeply engaged and invites you to join us in ongoing programs to get out the vote. We and our partner organizations are focused on swing states and super states. Together we're holding letter writings, phone banks, text banks, postcarding. We're even going to start painting rocks for voting rocks to get a new set of people involved, and then you leave them around your neighborhood or wherever you go hiking, take pictures and post them. We're working with MoCo Women, Do the Most Good, Maryland Women for Biden, and others. A pitch before we get to our speaker. Yes, we need you to vote, you know that, but the governor's oppressive voting plan makes it critical that you vote early and plan to vote by mail. Our advocacy committee led by Joanne Corvos has released a statement criticizing Governor Hogan's plan to make the point that it is dangerous to ask people to vote in person. We're not going to be able to staff all those voting sites, and a lot of people are going to be confused by the four-step process he has chosen for people to get absentee ballots. Okay, that's it for announcements. Let's get into our program. We've all heard phrases like turning anger into action or turning protest into policy. There's certainly a lot to be angry about and a lot to protest. The Supreme Court has just allowed fines and fees and left them standing in Florida for felons who have completed their jail terms and for which a state amendment was passed to allow them to begin voting again. President Trump wants to install federal troops in, quote, Democrat cities like Baltimore, and we've just lost our iconic Congressman John Lewis, as well as the Reverend T.C. Vivian. These are the times we recognize how critical our civil rights organizations are, and today's guest, Kristen Clarke, was just on the Pettus Bridge in Selma this March with Congressman Lewis for the 55th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. We wonder how it is that we still literally have law enforcement cracking heads in peaceful demonstrations, and that our president is sending unmarked federal forces into cities to terrorize and apparently kidnap peaceful demonstrators. Thanks to the steady focus of organizations like the Lawyers Committee, we know that these and other outrageous acts by our government and our countrymen and women are being tracked and pursued. The Lawyers Committee also filed a motion, for example, adding the DC police chief to the defendants in the suit over that June 1st event where President Trump had the Lafayette place cleared for his photo opportunity. Kristen Clarke is the President and Executive Director of the Lawyers Committee and takes to heart the words of Congressman Lewis, who said, when you see something that is not right, that is not just, you have to stand up, you have to speak out, and you have to get in the way. Under her leadership, the organization has been at the forefront of some of the nation's biggest racial justice problems today. The Lawyers Committee seeks to promote fair housing, community development, economic justice, voting rights, equal educational opportunity, criminal justice, judicial diversity, and more. Throughout her career, Ms. Clarke has focused on strengthening our democracy by combating discrimination faced by African Americans and other marginalized communities. Ms. Clarke formerly served as the head of the Civil Rights Bureau for New York State Attorney General's Office, where she led broad civil rights enforcement on criminal justice issues, education, and housing discrimination, fair lending, barriers to reentry, voting rights, immigrants' rights, gender inequality, disability rights, reproductive rights, LGBT rights. And under her leadership, that bureau secured landmark agreements with banks for unlawful redlining, with employers for barriers to reentry for people with criminal backgrounds, with police departments on reforms to policies and practices, and with major retailers for racial profiling of consumers, including one of the country's largest school districts concerning issues relating to the school to prison pipeline. Ms. Clarke received her undergraduate degree from Harvard University and her JD from Columbia Law School. With that, it is my great pleasure to welcome Kristen Clarke. Ms. Clarke, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Diana. Greatly appreciate that warm introduction, and an honor and a privilege to be with all of the WDC members who are here today. And great to be back. I joined this group, it was about 2 or 3 years ago for a luncheon event. So wonderful to reconnect. Let me just say at the outset that I hope that everybody is healthy, safe, and well. It's not lost on me that this is a difficult time for many people across our country. And for those of us here in the DC metro area, we've also been hard hit by the pandemic. So what a moment what a time to be alive. I appreciate the work and leadership of this group. I think that this is an incredibly challenging moment in our democracy. It's a moment that requires that all hands be on deck to safeguard our right to have voice in our democracy. So I appreciate the work of this group. You heard a bit about the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law. We are a national legacy civil rights organization founded in June of 1963, and our work to safeguard access to the ballot box lies at the heart of the work that we do, but we also stand at the forefront of many issues gripping the country when it comes to racial justice. We're fighting for a fairer criminal justice system, fighting for equal educational opportunity, fighting to protect the First Amendment right to protest, fighting for economic justice, and much, much more. We are a nonpartisan group. We believe that all of the work that we do has import to every community across the country, but most especially for African Americans and other communities of color who have faced historically high rates of disenfranchisement and discrimination. I'm going to put up a slide on the screen, and I just want to acknowledge my colleagues who are here today, Isabella, Cress Nash, and Katie Wang. Thank you for being here and for your help preparing for this meeting today. We'll put up our first slide, but this is an incredible moment for our country. We are in many respects dealing with pandemic upon pandemic. We're dealing with a public health crisis that has upended life across our country, but most especially for African Americans and people of color who've been disproportionately hard hit by the pandemic. We'll go to our next slide.
What happened?
Okay, great. So in addition to the pandemic, we also find ourselves literally witnessing the birth of a new racial justice movement in our country, arguably the largest movement of its kind, the largest such movement that we've ever seen in our nation's history, frankly. And it is one born of protest. And I am heartened and encouraged by the sustained protest activity that we are seeing across the country. In over 40% of communities across our country, we have seen Black Lives Matter protests in the last several weeks. These protests have been multiracial, multi-generational. They have been in urban areas and in rural areas. And I think the question is, how far will we push? How far are we willing to go in terms of agitating for change? Breonna Taylor, it's been 130 days since Breonna Taylor, a first responder in Louisville, Kentucky, was killed in her bed. Protests in Kentucky and across the country continue to lift up her name and continue to demand justice for her life. She was literally killed in her bed in the middle of the night. And while her death has been an inflection point that has sparked protests, I want to just say a word or two about her and who she was, because her life mattered. Breonna was just 26 years old. According to her mother, she had big dreams. She planned to have a lifelong career in healthcare. She was a proud EMT worker and incredibly beloved in her community, among her family members and her friends. Her family continues to grieve the loss of her life. There have literally been more people arrested in peaceful demonstrations surrounding the death of Breonna Taylor than there have been in connection with her actual death. 130 days, and the calls for justice continue. Go to our next slide. As Diana noted, we've seen protests right here in our region that have been incredibly powerful in lifting up the need for police reform, the need for a response to racism and white supremacy. And on June 1st, indeed, there were a number of peaceful demonstrators assembled in Lafayette Square, just outside of the White House. We represent a number of these peaceful demonstrators who endured what played out on June 1st. Our clients include a veteran. Our clients include a mother who was out with her 9-year-old son peacefully demonstrating. Our clients include religious leaders. All of these folks were out there for one singular purpose, lifting up the need for police reform, the need to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. And they were met with brute force at the hands of our federal government. A motley crew of various federal law enforcement officials descended on this group, fired tear gas, used bully clubs. They were in riot gear. It was a horrendous incident, an absolutely horrendous incident, and all to give President Trump the opportunity to have this photo op in front of the church seen here. We understand that Attorney General Barr issued the order for the use of federal force on this group of demonstrators. And, I think about our country's history, and I think about John Lewis, who endured the force of a billy club against his skull and bore that scar for the rest of his life. I think about the state troopers in the 60s who relentlessly used force without basis against those peacefully marching for the right to vote. And here we are in 2020 encountering similarly dark scenes. The only difference is that these dark scenes are now being carried out at the hands of the federal government. I think this is deeply troubling. It is a threat to the First Amendment right to protest, which lies at the heart of American democracy. If it weren't for protest and voices of dissent, in many instances, we would not have seen reform and change, which has been needed to move our country forward. And so we filed a federal lawsuit, Black Lives Matter DC versus Trump, along with our partners, our local affiliate here in Washington, DC, and the DC ACLU. And we allege that the federal government's actions violated both the First and Fourth Amendment, First and Fourth Amendments of the Constitution, among other things. An incredibly important lawsuit, and we're now starting to see similar lawsuits in other parts of the country as the administration steps up deployment of federal law enforcement in communities like Portland and elsewhere. These attacks on protesters are not isolated. We recently filed a suit on Juneteenth to protect the right to protest in the city of Charlotte. On June 2nd, Charlottesburg police surrounded peaceful protesters and violently used tear gas against them, pepper balls, and other forms of violence. The NAACP and other civil rights organizations that we represent are challenging the use of force, but did so on Juneteenth, an important day for the community in Charlotte that sought to use that day to really amplify the need to fight for racial justice and to again fight for police reform. As a result of the lawsuit that we filed on Juneteenth, we were able to get an emergency restraining order that barred the police from using these violent crowd control tactics and chemical agents against the protesters, and has freed the community up to exercise their First Amendment right to protest. In addition, you have places, some that are off the beaten path, like the city of Graham, North Carolina, that's not only just using force against protesters, but here the council actually adopted an ordinance that essentially banned protest activity outright. So we've filed a lawsuit here against the city council and against the mayor, challenging the ordinance that was put in place here. And we were successful in getting that ordinance lifted so that people can freely participate. But this is a moment where we need to stand up and speak out against efforts to silence those who are seeking to demonstrate and protest at this moment. And we need to be mindful that these threats are rearing their ugly head, not just outside the White House, but in communities both big and small. Folks in the city of Graham are actually protesting to remove a Confederate statue that has long stood outside their local courthouse. So, where do we go from here after the protests? Well, one, I think the protests are a part of our new normal in this country. They're not going to go away until our country is bold enough to put in place long overdue reform, a long overdue response to the police violence crisis that we face. We saw Congress a few weeks ago adopt the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. This is a bill that was passed in the House. I was pleased to join members of the House on the day that they passed the bill at the Capitol, but that bill sadly has stalled in the Senate and hasn't gotten the light of day under the Senate under Mitch McConnell's watch. Incredibly unfortunate, because the reason we are seeing this intense protest activity is because there is a desperate desire for reform, and the George Floyd Justice Policing Act is an important step in that direction. It's a bill that would make it easier to prosecute cops by changing the federal standard used to criminally hold officers accountable. It's a bill that would ban chokeholds and neck holds, ban racial profiling, end qualified immunity, among other basic steps that are needed for us to really confront this crisis. But my hope is that we'll see a lot of this protest activity translate into energy at the polls. on Election Day in November and beforehand in the various primary and runoff elections that are on the calendar. One of the things that we do at the Lawyers Committee is we fight tooth and nail against voter suppression. And in 2020, we are seeing significant threats to ballot access. We saw those threats pre-pandemic, and the pandemic has complicated the picture. In some parts of the country, officials are literally using the pandemic as a pretext to make it harder for people to vote. By way of example, in the state of Texas, the fear of contracting COVID is not a basis for getting access to an absentee ballot. In the state of Tennessee, you can be criminally prosecuted if you distribute absentee ballot applications to the public. So we're in court right now fighting to address many of these barriers and restrictions that are literally putting people in the impossible position of having to choose between their health and exercising the right to vote. The pandemic has, literally upended elections in every corner of the country. And we've seen those problems up close and personal through our work fighting to safeguard voting rights this season. Kentucky was one place where officials did a decent job providing access to absentee ballots, but really underestimated the fact that there are still people who deeply value the importance of going out and voting in person. They want to do so under conditions that are safe and secure, but there are many people who are not comfortable dropping a ballot in the mailbox and want to get out and vote in person on Election Day. Kentucky eliminated many of its polling sites, reducing about 3,700 polling locations to just about 200 across the state for its recent primary election. And the impact of that was felt in many places like Lexington, where voters endured long lines, and in Jefferson County, which is home to Louisville. And Jefferson County literally had one polling site serving its 767,000 residents, a number of whom voted by absentee ballot, but many of whom wanted to vote in person on Election Day. Sadly, this one voting site was at an expo center. You needed a car to get there. There was a bus that provided a free shuttle from one location in downtown Louisville. But the day ended quite tragically. You had long lines of cars, of people waiting to get into this massive exposition center's parking lot, and people who ran to that door, people who left their jobs, 9 to 5, many of them essential workers like Breonna Taylor, frankly, and who raced to get to vote and found the doors locked on them. Fortunately, an emergency lawsuit was filed that found that people who were in the parking lot essentially would not be stripped of the right to vote. And so those folks did ultimately get to vote that day. But this was the scene at 6 o'clock in Louisville. People, tons of them, literally banging on the door to exercise their right to vote. Georgia was another place where we saw problems this season. Georgia delayed its primary election and went forward on June 9th, but voters turned out, many of whom value voting in person, only to be subjected to long lines that resulted from malfunctioning voting machines or polling sites that opened up late. Many voters were forced to wait in lines that stretched for up to 3 hours. We were on top of the situation and identified 4 crisis areas in the state. We pushed election officials to take steps to voluntarily extend polling hours to give these folks a fair opportunity to vote. 3 complied, but 1 didn't. So we went to lawsuit and got an emergency order that extended poll hours to give people a fair chance to vote. But no doubt, for some people, they get one shot. There are many people who have jobs or childcare issues and don't have the luxury of coming out 2 or 3 times to see when officials get it right. So for us, this is among the most heartbreaking of situations that we encounter. We want to make sure that nobody is disenfranchised in our country and that everybody who gets out of their home, out of their job to go and vote is able to successfully do so. The Supreme Court in 2013 issued a devastating decision that cut out the heart of one of our nation's most important federal civil rights laws, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that decision, issued in June of 1963, brought to a grinding halt a core provision of the Voting Rights Act that required certain states with very long and egregious histories of voting discrimination to obtain federal review of their voting rules, of new voting rules, before they could take effect. That provision, the Section 5 federal review process, has helped to literally block, right at the outset, hundreds of discriminatory voting changes before they could take root. It applied in places like Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, parts of North Carolina, and other states, and did remarkable and powerful work, literally blocking discrimination and preventing states from doing things like shuttering polling sites or purging the voting rolls or coming up with 11th hour new rules and qualifications for getting registered to vote. So if we go back a slide, one thing that we have seen in the wake of the fallout of this ruling have been states that have shut polling sites left and right. There have been over 1,200 polling sites in Black communities or communities serving largely people of color, where we've seen polling sites shuttered, making it harder for people to vote. And that decision to shutter polling sites in ways that impact people of color would have been decisions subject to federal review and would have been decisions likely blocked by that critical review process. So we are here in 2020 in a very vulnerable state in American democracy, one where we have seen the floodgates of voter suppression open up, one where we are left more vulnerable in the wake of the Supreme Court's ruling, which has brought to a halt that federal review process, and one, frankly, that defies the legacy of Congressman John Lewis. Congressman John Lewis is someone who dedicated his entire life, from the time he was a kid out fighting at the age of 15, all the way through his final days. He is somebody who's dedicated his life's work to fighting for the right to vote and fighting to safeguard the Voting Rights Act. In response to this devastating Supreme Court ruling, this past December, the House passed an important bill, H.R. 4. H.R. 4 is a bill that responds to the Supreme Court's decision and would restore the Voting Rights Act by coming up with a new formula for determining the states where this federal review process is needed today. Congressman Lewis presided over the vote for H.R. 4, which was successful. It's a bill that passed with some marginal level of bipartisan support, and it's a bill that has languished. It's been 228 days that bill has languished on the desk of Senator Mitch McConnell, who has refused to give that bill a hearing or show that bill the light of day. And it is incredibly unfortunate. I have dedicated my life's work to protecting the Voting Rights Act and resisting many of the constitutional challenges that the bill has come up against. And in 2005, 2006, Congress held hearings looking at this unique provision of the Voting Rights Act and came to the conclusion that it was absolutely still needed, that it's done important work throughout the years, and that it's helped literally to block voting discrimination from ever taking root in communities. The bill passed 98-0 in the Senate, 390-33 in the House. I remember being there for the vote in the Senate, and Congressman John Lewis and also the late Senator Kennedy were kind of on the floor, the center of the floor as senators came forth and voted in favor of renewing Section 5. It was a remarkable day. Both of these men I deem moral compasses of the Senate, and their leadership at that moment and throughout the career has been really helpful in putting Congress on a path to taking bold steps, bold action to protect civil rights. My hope is that we will see Mitch McConnell use this moment. He put out a statement this past weekend expressing remorse on the passing of John Lewis, and if he means what he says, he will use this moment to take steps to renew the Voting Rights Act and to hold hearings in the Senate now, and he'll do so swiftly. I had an article in the USA Today where I made this point. We'll try and put a link up to that article in the chat room. But I deem that an incredibly important part of this moment that we're in. We're at a moment where we are fighting racism, where we are fighting white supremacy, where we are fighting for police reform. But undergirding all of that work is the right to vote. This is another important pressure point, another important place for people to register their objections, to hold officials accountable, and to leverage their voice in ways to really command change. So the work that we do to safeguard access to democracy, I deem truly critical to this unique moment that we're in. Let me talk a little bit about our election protection program. Election protection is the nation's largest and longest running nonpartisan voter protection program. It's anchored by a hotline, 866 Our Vote, and it is supported by over 300 local, state, and national organizations in the democracy space, all of whom rely on our 866 Our Vote hotline to support the important work that they do in communities across the country. We have a network of over 4,000 lawyers who volunteer to support this effort, grassroots volunteers who support the work, a suite of hotlines to help ensure that we're reaching voters for whom English may not be their first language, and a network of over 100 law firms that help position us to mount emergency litigation when we need to fight voter suppression and to fight some of the barriers that voters are up against on election day. Incredibly important work, and work that we deem critical at this moment, and work where we're always looking for more supporters. So with that, if you are interested in learning more about our election protection program, I encourage you to visit these links. And if you're interested in learning more about the fight for racial justice and the work that's underway at the Lawyers Committee and across the racial justice community, we encourage you to visit our website, www.lawyerscommittee.org. I'll close by just noting that, again, I think that we are literally witnessing the birth of an unprecedented racial justice movement. It's one that I think presents lots of hope. It's one that offers tremendous opportunity. And my hope is that in partnership with groups like WDC, that we can do the hard work, the uncomfortable work that's really necessary to get us over the hump when it comes to really pushing back against racism, white supremacy, police violence, and problems that have really torn at the fabric of our nation for far too long. So with that, I'll stop there and would be happy, Diana, to take any questions that the WDC membership has.
Well, thank you, Ms. Clarke. That was tremendous, and we're delighted to hear from you again, and are hoping actually to get you back, hopefully after some dust settles in the best possible way in November. So we've had a number of questions. I have to tell you, a lot of us who are involved pretty deeply in this stuff were horrified at the reporting coming out of Florida about the governor DeSantis deciding that, and the courts supporting him, deciding that it was okay to keep that that fine and fee requirement that the released felons had to not only find out but also pay all remaining fees and fines before they could actually exercise the right to vote that had been amended into the Constitution. It turns out that through a number of connections trying to find out if the group reported on was a good target for us to get behind, we wound up being referred to the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, to Julie Hauk, or I think that's how it's pronounced. So all things seem to lead to the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. The first question, I think, is on the impact of the conservative judges and whether you are seeing now in the way things are playing out as you seek restraining orders and as you seek enforcement, whether you're already seeing those appointments play out in how this process is unwinding for us. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. What a devastating issue. Mitch McConnell actually recently celebrated the 200th confirmation to our federal courts. And this administration has moved at unprecedented and lightning speed to stack the courts with nominees who do not reflect the diversity of our country and whose records bring to bear a level of extremism that really raises questions about their ability to be fair and independent on civil rights issues, on issues like the fair interpretation and application of the Constitution. We are starting to see some impact and have felt the impact in some of our cases where the outcomes have defied logic, have felt like we're not getting a fair shot or even getting a chance to stand up and state our claims and be fairly heard. That said, we cannot give up on the rule of law. We cannot give up on the central role that courts occupy in our democracy. We have to keep fighting. I will say that I do deem the work of nonpartisan organizations especially critical in this moment where we're starting to see politicization of the courts. That said, I think it's also important that we start to work on building that pipeline of diverse talent that can be quickly tapped into once opportunities are reopened again for us to restore the courts. So this is an incredibly important issue. We're actually holding a program tomorrow where we are encouraging law students to pursue judicial clerkships, deeming this one small step to preparing a next generation of people to serve on the bench. And in the state of Maryland, I know that we see diversity on the at some degree on the state judiciary, and there's still more work to be done. But I do think that opportunities to serve at state courts right now are incredibly important because, again, this is a pipeline that can be tapped into once order is restored. At some point, the project of rebuilding and restoring the courts must become a national priority.
Thank you. Some of the questions essentially go to a straight face aspect of all this, these sort of transparently obvious efforts to just crush the vote by reducing the number of voting sites, by prohibiting, criminalizing, you said, the distribution of absentee ballot or vote by mail ballot applications. How are those things, I mean, can you talk a little bit about what it's like to go into court or to look at these people across the table and just have them, do they look down? Is there any sense of the reality of what they're doing?
I think this is voter suppression on steroids. That's what we're seeing in the country right now. We're seeing baseless attacks on absentee balloting, allegations falsely made that absentee balloting is rife with fraud, We're seeing officials, again, using the pandemic as a pretext to deny people access to the ballot. We're seeing officials who continue to exploit the environment in the wake of the Supreme Court's 2013 decision, which cut out a core provision of the Voting Rights Act. We're seeing a Justice Department that is completely MIA. This Justice Department, to our knowledge, hasn't brought a single case to protect the rights of voters of color. They've been doing some work to protect military voters, but no active affirmative work to safeguard voting rights for people of color, which is their mission. So this is a very vulnerable moment. And it's one in which we need not be defeated by the threats or the challenges. We just have to be cognizant and fully aware of them. And then we've got to do the work. I see that Gina has, in the chat, shared the importance of alerting everyone that we know about absentee ballots. Which, you know, and I think that this is the work that we need to do between now and November. We've got just over 110 days to make sure that everyone in our network, everyone in our community is fully aware of the steps that they have to take to participate in vote by mail this season. And we need to make sure that people are getting registered to vote. Some of the kind of organic ways in which people make it onto the registration rolls have come to a grinding halt. You've got campuses not able to do registration drives. You've got churches not able to activate congregants in the same way. You've got groups not able to knock on doors. And so this is the work that we need to do right now to make up for some of that lost ground and to ensure a successful election this November.
So 2 questions. Well, first of all, I want to point out that Isabella put into the chat a recent item that you wrote, and I hope people get a chance to click on that and read it. Do we get to sue Bill Barr? That's a question that's come up twice in here. Can we sue Bill Barr for what he's doing or failing to do?
We are suing Bill Barr, proudly so, and we're suing President Trump, and we're suing all of the federal officials that were behind the Lafayette Square attack that was carried out on June 1st. The Justice Department says that Attorney General Barr is the one who issued the order for use of force, for use of violence against those peaceful demonstrators. Interestingly enough, we don't see Attorney General Barr doing interviews too much. But shortly after our lawsuit, he did take a few interviews where he tried to dial back his role. So it seems, saying, I wasn't quite the one who issued the order. It wasn't really me. I was there, but not the one telling people what to do. We'll see them in court. We're in federal court in DC right now, and our goal is to hold this administration accountable for conduct that we deem in plain violation of the First and Fourth Amendment of the Constitution.
Good. I think that'll be satisfying to watch. I suspect, as usual, it'll come too late for this cycle, but hopefully be a bit of a guardrail. Why do we have to have restraining orders? What is it that gives jurisdictions the authority to put in such clearly unconstitutional measures and then requires groups like you to come after them before we can dismantle it back into constitutional order?
Yeah, well, I guess restraining orders can be used in two different ways. We go to court to get restraining orders on unlawful activity, and so that's what we've done in North Carolina, where we've gone after officials who've unlawfully tried to restrain and limit peaceful demonstrators. But I guess that question is using the term in a slightly different way to say what prevents jurisdictions from putting in place orders limiting protest activity. Sometimes those orders are unlawful, and it's why we and a number of groups have filed lawsuits all across the country challenging the unconstitutional limits and restraints being put on peaceful demonstrators right now. The secret federal police that we've seen in Portland and that the administration suggests will be coming to a city near you soon is also being subject to litigation right now. So it's an incredibly fraught moment, but it's one where we're not standing by idly. We're not sitting on our hands. as the administration undertakes action that we believe is in gross violation of our civil rights and of our constitutional rights. We will fight back. We will make clear that they are not above the law. We will force them to stand up in court and to demonstrate that their actions comply with the law. And we'll keep doing that until the bitter end.
And who would you say are your best partners in terms of other civil rights organizations doing this? And assuming you are eventually successful in the slow-moving machinery of our judicial system, what would be the ideal outcome of, for example, what you're trying to do in Portland and prevent in places like Baltimore that the president's already threatened?
Yeah, you want broad proclamations that have far reach and far impact. You want precedent that can help discourage officials in other cities from copycat activity. So that's what we're seeking here. And our best partners have been groups like Black Lives Matter, the NAACP, and other groups that are at the heart of racial justice work and the racial justice movement. And the role we play is using the law, using courtrooms to stand up to protect their rights, to protect the rights of all Americans.
Do you have an opinion you can share with us about DeRay McKesson's initiative, #8Can'tWait? We had him as a guest preceding you about a week ago, and just wonder if you have some thoughts on his initiative.
I'm not familiar with his initiative, although he's a friend, a colleague, and a great partner in this work and in the fight.
Okay, thank you. Just for the record, WDC not only welcomed DeRay McKesson as our last speaker, but also has taken a formal position supporting his 8 immediate measures that require no legislation that can be implemented immediately as policy by any jurisdiction, small or large, state level or extremely local. Let's see, who other than you, who among government officials is in charge of fighting this pernicious direction that jurisdictions are taking?
Repeat the question?
Well, the question is, I think, is aimed at asking you if there are jurisdictional authorities that should be doing the work that you and the ACLU and others are being left to do.
Well, the administration should be doing its job. Our agency should be living up to their mission and should be protecting vulnerable communities, should be protecting civil rights, should be enforcing federal civil rights law. I started off my career in the Justice Department. That's the job of our federal government, and that's not happening right now. And what it's meant is that for organizations like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, like the ACLU and other organizations, that we're stepping in to fill in the gaps. We're stepping in to be the people's lawyer. We're stepping in to protect people's rights when our federal government is causing harm. I'm also encouraged by the way that we've seen state attorney generals step up, not everywhere across the country, but in many places we're starting to see state AGs take a more aggressive stance and also work to fill in some of the voids that we face. But it's been a tremendously, challenging period for civil rights organizations that have basically had to take on the work that the federal government had historically done,
right,
but is also often at odds with a federal government that sadly is so often hostile to civil rights and hostile to the rights of vulnerable communities.
I guess it's a little bit like whack-a-mole. You've got to cover everything from the state level down, and it's all over the country in different iterations and different manifestations.
That's right.
Many people who have disabilities will need to vote in person. Think of people who are blind, who may not have a computer, much less a printer. The online forms are not accessible, and polling places have wheelchair accessible tables with computers that work well. Is this a situation that you think is in most jurisdictions? Are they going to require some kind of in-person voting to accommodate voters like this?
Yeah, and I know we're coming up on time.
Okay.
ADA issues are significant, and we have a number of partner groups that do a lot of work to ensure ADA compliance at polling sites across the country. But this is a very, very real issue.
Quick last question, if I may. Give us some hopeful signs. Give us a little bit of something high to go out on.
Well, tomorrow I'm going to be testifying before the Senate Rules Committee. So this is a bipartisan hearing being held in the Senate on the issue of funding for states and the issue of getting federal funding to states to ensure that they have the resources in place to make this election season a successful one, making sure that they have the money to put in place online voter registration systems if they don't have it, to provide postage paid envelopes with absentee ballot applications,
right,
to pay and recruit poll workers. I am encouraged by the fact that we're having this bipartisan hearing tomorrow. The hearing will be held at 10 a.m. and I'll see if we can share a link to that hearing so that you can follow along. But these bipartisan moments, I think, present moments of opportunity and present moments of hope. Our elections matter. We need to make sure that in the midst of an unprecedented health pandemic, that states can get this right. If the primary was a trial run for November, there's so many states that literally failed, voters. Voters were subjected to insanely long lines. Voters didn't get their absentee ballots in time. Voters were disenfranchised in places like Wisconsin because of an 11th hour decision by the Supreme Court that said, unless your ballot is postmarked by X date, it just absolutely will not count, contrary to the rule that had been in place prior to the Supreme Court's ruling. We've got to get this right in November. I encourage all of you to reach out to your senator and to express support for federal funding for states to get this right in the midst of a pandemic. I encourage you, if you've been marching and protesting, to keep marching and protesting. If you've been speaking out virtually, to keep speaking out virtually. I encourage you to take action that feels uncomfortable. I encourage you to speak about the things that you don't ordinarily speak about. Speak up and call out white supremacy and racism and police violence in ways that we've been hesitant to previously. And I think if we do all of that, that a brighter, bolder future awaits us in 2021 and beyond.
Great. Well, thank you, Ms. Clarke, again for returning to talk to WDC, and we look forward to welcoming you back, as I said, on the other side of November. Good luck with your testimony tomorrow, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. We are going to have a couple closing remarks, and then I've got my surprise guest who actually did show up a little late. So WDC is going to continue bringing you speakers to address these issues of our times, and we'll be announcing the next speaker soon. Please remember to sign up for your absentee ballot. Urge everyone you know to do likewise, and remind people that voter suppression is simply a confirmation that your vote matters. Our website has everything you need except the afternoon snack, voter engagement resources, links to speakers and events, an extensive list of resources that you can see here, books, videos, podcasts, to get yourself informed about this moment in our countries and the reality in our country and the realities that got us here. And of course, please join or renew your membership with WDC. We've got our work cut out for us. I hope you will join us and our sister organizations in doing this work and in bearing in mind that part of that is to elect the change we need. I think we can now cut to Dr. Gilberto Zelaya from, sorry, my poor slide coordinator. He's the Director of Public Outreach for the Montgomery County Board of Elections, and he's got a quick PSA for us.
How are
Dr.
you?
Gilberto.
Good afternoon,
Dr.
everyone.
Zelaya.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes,
Good.
hi.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. As you all know, all roads lead back to the Montgomery County Board of Elections, November 3rd, and during early voting. Yes, the governor made his proclamation. We highly recommend that you do not wait until the Maryland State Board of Elections mails out the vote by mail application. You can submit your request today. I just put on the chat our phone number the actual link, or you could also text the letters VBM for vote by mail, VBM, to 77788. And the reason why I asked of this is it helps our staff. It mitigates being overwhelmed with hundreds of thousands of vote by mail requests in September. I'm pretty sure you've made up your mind if you are voting in person or by mail. Please, we highly encourage voting by mail. You could text VBM to 77788. If you don't have a printer, call our office. We will print and mail you, or we will help you through the submission of your request. We are looking also at recruiting election poll workers. I know we're asking a lot of our civic-minded citizens, but we do need poll workers to implement in-person voting for voters unable to vote. Whether you have a desire to vote in person, we cannot force you otherwise. We're here to serve. But if you know me, my style is being honest, and there will be lines. If we're limited with the number of election poll workers to serve our voters having the desire to vote in person, you will wait in line. It's inevitable. I wish I could say that we have 6,000 election judges in the closet that we could pull out to line them up to serve our 200 plus voting precincts. We are making the adjustments to serve, but I highly recommend you vote by mail. Once again, VBM to 77788. The link was provided in the chat. You could go also to our website at 777vote.org. Please don't wait for the Maryland State Board of Elections to mail your application. Submit your request today, and that will go a long way with helping our staff to process your requests. Once again, as opposed to processing upwards of 300,000 to 400,000 requests several weeks before the onset of early voting or election day.
Thank you, Dr. Zelaya, and good luck to you. I hope we will do what we can at this end to get people complying with your request.
Please, thank you.
Thank you for your patient work with us. And WDC is looking forward to helping all of our voters and all of our friends reach out to your circle of friends and your networks to get this done. We're lucky enough to live in a community that cares, with elected leaders who lean in, and thoughtful scholars and hard workers of nonprofits like the Lawyers Committee. I would urge you, in addition to giving money to all the worthy supporters, all the worthy candidates out there, to consider supporting the Lawyers Committee. It is a longstanding organization with a stellar, really sterling reputation. And now, in a time of shifting priorities, the work really remains in our hands. We have the power to change the world by changing the way we behave in it. So I wish you all a healthy and productive week of organizing, and, as the Congressman Lewis would say to us, good trouble. Our great friend Scott Weber is going to cycle through some slides that I was supposed to carefully pace myself through. So thank you for joining us for this discussion, and stay well, everybody. Thank you.